this video, I want to talk a little bit about a concept known as externalities. And really what we're going to be thinking about is the issue of pollution, where pollution comes from, why it's created, and then what we can do to try to have less of it. Okay? So we're going to think about how markets result in the creation of pollution. Actually, any economic activity results in the creation of pollution, but we'll think about specifically how the issue of pollution is dealt with within a market-based system. So let's start by thinking about this question: what's the right amount of pollution? And that's a kind of a tricky question, because if you go out and you ask people on the street what's the right amount of pollution, everybody's knee-jerk reaction is to say 0. But we have to think very carefully about that question, because it's much more subtle than just saying no. We need to strive for having none. What we know about this world that we live in is that any type of economic activity, the production of anything, creates pollution. Pollution is not something like tires that are solely created in a factory. We don't have pollution factories out there. If we had pollution factories and that was where pollution came from, then we just close those factories down. Pollution is a byproduct of the production of everything. And so if, as a matter of public policy, we wanted to have 0 pollution, then the only way to achieve that is to have 0 production of anything or everything. Well, clearly we don't want that. And so we have to figure out, well, how do we balance the benefits that we get from the production of things like baby formula and medicines and food and transportation to different places and entertainment? How do we pick the right amount of that so that we don't have too much pollution? Because pollution is something that we don't want to have. We want to have less of that. So we have to think about, well, what are the benefits of the things that we're producing out there in the economy, but also what are the costs? And the pollution is one of the costs of production. And unfortunately, a lot of times the costs created by pollution tend to kind of get pushed aside and ignored, because they can be hard to put a dollar amount on. And so it's easy to ignore them. It's easy to ignore anything that you don't have a dollar amount for. But we have to think about, if we're going to make good economic decisions, we can't ignore that. So let's start by thinking about a concept known as externalities. Externalities. So here's the definition of an externality. We can have a positive externality, we can have a negative externality. But here's what an externality is. An externality is either a benefit or a cost that affects somebody that's not directly involved in the production or consumption of a good or service. Okay? So let me give you a different, less sophisticated definition of it. An externality exists anytime one person's behavior affects somebody else. So somebody's either getting a benefit or bearing a cost, and that benefit or cost that they're bearing is a result of somebody else's behavior. It's not a result of their behavior. Okay, so let's think about a negative externality, or some examples of negative externalities. This would be a situation, negative externalities, a situation where one person's behavior is creating a cost that is being borne by somebody else. Okay? So the classic economic example of a negative externality is secondhand smoke. So this would be a situation where the smoker is breathing out, exhaling smoke, and then somebody else that's in the vicinity ends up breathing it, and they're breathing that smoke. It's creating a cost for them that's not part of their behavior, it's part of somebody else's behavior. Production of a good that creates pollution. That's an example of a negative externality. Production of a good that creates pollution. So we've got, let's say, a firm, a business that's producing some good, and that during the course of production of that good, maybe there's something that comes out of some smokestack, or maybe it's something that is emitted into a waterway, or maybe it's noise pollution. And then there are people outside of the firm, maybe people in the vicinity of the factory that are just going about their daily lives, and they have to breathe in the stuff that comes out of the smokestack. That would be an example of a negative externality. It could be anybody driving a car, you driving your car. If you drive your car, then there are things that are coming out of your exhaust pipe that go into the air, and other people breathe those things in, and so anytime you're driving, you're creating a negative externality. It's not very big, but it's still a negative externality, and you might think, well, no, I've got an electric car, but it's still the same, right? It's just that the emissions aren't coming out of your car, they're coming out of the electricity factory that's generating the electricity. It's just that the emissions are coming from a different location. And keep in mind that a majority of the electricity that we use is still generated using fossil fuels. And so it's still creating a negative externality. Again, not a very big one. The size doesn't matter. It's a negative externality. And there are lots of other examples. Playing your music loudly so that it disturbs somebody else, that would create a negative externality. There are also positive externalities. So if we think about some examples of positive externalities, something like you getting a college education. So if you get a college education, then people with more education tend to make more responsible decisions. They tend to be more productive in society, and when people are more productive, that benefits me. So you getting your college education actually passes on a little bit of benefit to me because it improves society. Not a lot. You actually capture a vast majority of the benefit of your college education, but there is some benefit that you pass on to other people. So that's an example. Immunizations. So you being immunized or you getting your kids immunized creates a healthier society in the future, so other people benefit from that. So those are examples of positive, negative externalities. Another example of a positive externality would be, say, you spending time landscaping your yard to create a pretty scene that somebody could drive by and see. So if I drive by your yard and you've spent a lot of time making it look nice, then I could drive by and say, oh wow, I like driving by here. That makes my day just a little bit better. And there, you of course can enjoy it. You're getting the benefit, but you're also passing along a little bit of benefit to me. So, what we've talked about earlier in the class, we've talked about a situation where free markets, what we know is that free markets maximize the economic well-being of both buyers and sellers. We've seen that total surplus is maximized when you have a free market. Now, what we're going to think about now is what happens if there's an externality present. And what we're going to see is that a free market does not maximize total surplus in the presence of an externality, either a negative externality or a positive externality. So if externalities are present, this is a situation where the government may play a role to try to move the market outcome to a better outcome, something where total surplus is actually bigger than it would be if the government didn't do something. Let's start by thinking about a negative externality. So a negative externality is a situation where the supply curve, the marginal cost curve, does not capture all of the costs associated with the production of the good. So we'll think about production of some good that creates a negative externality. So let's start by thinking about what this picture is going to look like. We've got the price up here and the quantity down here. Let's think about, say, the production of electricity. Okay, so let's say that this is the creation of some amount of electricity. And so here's the price of electricity. Now we've got some demand curve, a market demand curve. All of us have some demand for electricity. And then there's going to be a supply curve. I'm going to label this supply curve, call this private. Remember, that's a marginal cost curve. Anytime we have a supply curve, we know that the market supply curve is just the horizontal summation of all of the individual firm supply curves. So that market supply curve represents the cost of production. It's a marginal cost curve. But now let's label it private, because what we're going to do is we're going to think about, let's say, S private represents the private costs of production of electricity. So it represents the private costs of production of electricity. Now, what we mean by that is that it represents the cost that the electrical utility faces. Okay, so the utility is going to have costs associated with production of the electricity that it generates, and they would respond. They would maximize their profit by looking where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, but they're only going to respond to the costs that they themselves bear. So when we say private costs, we're thinking about the private sector versus, say, the public sector, maybe the public in general. That's probably a better way to think about it. But now what that means is that there's going to be some cost that the utility doesn't bear. Maybe they emit something out of smokestacks that particulate matter, or maybe it's some pollution that clouds the sky or creates some health impact for people. Okay, so there's going to be, let's say that the firm is able to pass some cost on to everybody else. This would be the pollution. So whatever form that pollution takes. It could also be that maybe it's this is a electricity generating facility where water is used to cool something down, and then that water is emitted back out into a lake and it warms up the water temperature. That's a situation where some cost would be passed on. So the firm is able to pass some cost to everyone else. Okay, we call this the external cost. The external cost. So if we think about what this supply curve represents, if we were to pick a quantity out here and go up to the supply curve, the height of that supply curve would represent their private cost, but then there's going to be some additional external costs. So if we were to go up a little bit higher at each quantity, if we were to go up a little bit higher, this vertical distance is going to represent the external cost. So let's have a little arrow that says, here's our external cost. That's the cost that the firm itself doesn't have to bear. They're passing that on to everybody else. So if we were to think about the total cost, if we were to have another supply curve that was everywhere that vertical distance higher than the original one, we'll call this the supply curve. We'll call this the social cost. I'll just say social. That's the full cost to society. It's made up of the private cost, which is this distance, plus the external cost that's borne by people outside of the firm. So out here at these quantities, the private cost would be this vertical distance, and then there's this extra external cost that's passed on. So this curve represents the full cost to society. Now, if we think about what happens if the firm is able to pass that cost on, then the free market outcome is going to be right here. Let's call this Q, I'm going to say free market. There's the quantity that would be produced if the firm is able to pass this cost on to everybody else, and here would be the price in the free market. I'm just going to, let's say free market. There's the free market quantity and price. But now let's think about what the right quantity and price would be. And the right quantity and price is going to be the quantity that exists and the price that exists if no cost is passed on, or let's say no cost is ignored. So from society's perspective, the full cost of production at the margin would be represented by this curve, and right here would be the right quantity. This would be the quantity that the benevolent social planner would choose, because the benevolent social planner would not just pass this cost on to somebody else and then not worry about it. The benevolent social planner wouldn't ignore any cost. And so right here is what we would call the efficient quantity. And right up here would be the efficient price. So let's call this Q star, and we'll call this P star. So here's the conclusion that we get. Anytime we've got a negative externality where production of some good, and it's not just production, it could be any of these things, what we see is that the free market results in too much of the good being produced, and the free market price is too low. It doesn't reflect the full cost of production. So once the externality is accounted for, we would produce less of the good and charge a higher price. Okay, so let's say negative externality results in production of too much of the good. And let's say here, with a free market. So anytime you've got a free market and an externality, negative externality is present, the free market's going to result in too much being produced. And we have a name for this. We call this market failure. Market failure. I've never been a big fan of this term because I think that the term itself makes it seem as if the market is not adjusting to eliminate surpluses or shortages. That's not what we're talking about here. The market fails not in that price doesn't adjust, or if a surplus is present, there's no incentive to lower price. That's not what happens. The market still clears. It's just that the market results in the wrong quantity, an inefficient amount of the quantity being produced. Okay, so there's going to be deadweight loss created. That's what we mean when we say market failure. Now let's think about what happens if there's a positive externality. So let me clear this off and then we'll take a look at that. Let's take a look now at what the picture is going to look like if we have a positive externality. Now remember, a positive externality is when there's some benefit that's being passed on to somebody that's not engaged in the behavior themselves. So for this one, let's do college education. So let's suppose our quantity is here. We'll just say college education. We could describe that in terms of number of students getting educated or the number of college hours of education. We don't even need to worry about that. Let's just say it's quantity of college education. We could even talk about it in terms of maybe scholarships, but let's just leave it as that. This will be the price of a college education. So let's put our demand curve up here and our supply curve, market demand, market supply. Now in this situation there's a benefit that's being passed on. Now remember, the supply curve represents the cost, and when we were talking about a negative externality and there was a cost being passed on, we recognize the fact that that supply curve didn't represent the whole cost. But now there's a benefit being passed on. Remember that it's the demand curve that represents the benefit. So we're going to call this demand curve let's call it the marginal private benefit. I'm just going to put private down here like we did with our supply curve. Represents the marginal private benefit. But now there's some benefit that's being passed on. We could call it an external benefit. And so if we were to pick any quantity and go up to the height of the demand curve, the height of the demand curve would be capturing the private benefit. That would be the benefit that the students themselves get from going to college. But then there's going to be some external benefit that's passed on. And so let's suppose that that external benefit is, say, that vertical distance. Okay? And it's going to be that vertical distance whether we're talking about this quantity or this quantity. There's our external benefit. So if we were to represent the full benefit, the curve that captures all benefits associated with college education, then we'll call this one D social. That represents all of the benefits that are captured by the private individuals engaged in getting the education, but also the benefit that's captured by society because other people are getting an education. So keep in mind, the benevolent social planner would never ignore that benefit that's going to other people. Now, if we were to think about where the free market goes, well, individual students are going to respond to their own private benefit. And so this would be the outcome in a free market. We'll call that Q, free market. And this would be the price. Now, if we think about what would happen if we don't ignore any benefit, the benevolent social planner would point out, okay, well, this is what happens in the free market, but right up here is the quantity that would be provided if we were thinking about actually maximizing total surplus. We'll call that Q star. Here would be P star. So we get a similar thing to what we saw with a negative externality, except it's in the opposite direction. What we see is that with a positive externality, the free market results in too little of the good being provided. So the practical conclusion that we could get from this is that there is a good justification for why the government would want to get involved in increasing the amount of college education that takes place, whether that be through grants or whether that be through scholarships of some type. Or subsidizing universities in some way. There's a good theoretical explanation for why we wouldn't want to just rely on the free market. Okay? Results in too little of the good if there's a positive externality. Let's ask this question: what causes externalities? What causes externalities? And there's kind of an interesting explanation for what causes externalities. What it boils down to is that there's some failure of the property rights structure. So let's just say that the main cause, the cause of externalities, whether they're positive or negative, is what we would call an incomplete property rights structure. Incomplete property rights structure. That's what allows some people to pass on costs to other people. And it's also the problem of not being able to capture all of the benefits associated with a positive externality. So let me give you an example to kind of illustrate what's going on here. Let's suppose that you own a piece of land, and that land has a lake on it, and let's suppose that you lease some of the land to a paper mill, and then the mill pollutes your lake. Well, if you own the land and the lake is on your land and you lease that land to the mill and they pollute your lake, then you can hold them responsible. The court system will allow you to sue them as long as you can prove that they somehow did this beyond the contract that you agreed upon, then they will be held liable. In that case, there's no externality because they're not able to pass on the cost. You can hold them responsible for it. But now let's suppose that that mill is built on, let's say, privately owned land on the banks of a lake that's owned by the state. Now that creates a whole different situation, because if the lake is owned by the state, then in reality it's not owned by anybody. If everybody owns it, that's the same thing as nobody owning it. Because if you yourself as a private citizen cannot sue somebody else for polluting a public lake. Okay? So in the absence of any type of government regulation that prohibits them, and there are certain restrictions, but emitting some pollutant into a lake is not completely illegal. You have to abide by whatever the government regulations are, but nobody can sue for that. In that case, the cost of the pollution is passed on to society. That is a situation where the firm would be able to make that cost external to them. They don't have to worry about it. And what is different between the two situations is who owns the property, whether or not it's owned by a private individual or whether or not it's public property. Public property means that no private individual is able to sue based upon what happens to that property. Okay? You can't challenge anybody else's ability to use the lake, and that's what creates the problem. It's an incomplete property rights structure. There's a failure of anybody to own that. So now let's think about how we fix that problem. The way we fix it is we have to address the property rights structure, and there's let's say a handful of ways that we can do that. So let's talk about private solutions to externality. Private solutions to externalities. I'm just going to abbreviate that. And let's start by reminding ourselves that the efficient amount of pollution is not zero. We have to balance the good that we get out of production of the goods and services, or in the picture that we drew, the good that we get out of production of that electricity. And remember that production of that electricity is allowing people to heat their homes when it's cold, and allowing people to have lights, and it's allowing people to run let's say appliances in their house, all of those things that enhance people's well-being. But then there's this negative side effect, and that is that it's also creating some pollution. So we have to balance the good that we get from the things that we can use the electricity for with the bad that we get from production of the electricity. So if we think about, let's draw a little picture here. Let's suppose that we think about pollution reduction here, quantity of pollution reduction. So here's our quantity. Let's put our price, let's put just dollars up here. This will be the cost and benefit. So if we think about what's the right quantity of pollution reduction, well, there's going to be a marginal cost of pollution reduction. It's going to be upward sloping. The more pollution we reduce, the more costly it is to reduce pollution. Let's suppose that we're not reducing any pollution. then that means there's going to be some low-hanging fruit, so to speak. There's going to be some easy things that we can do that have relatively low cost that allow us to reduce pollution. But then as we reduce more and more pollution, it gets harder to reduce more and more. You can install scrubbers on smokestacks, and that will capture a large part of the pollution, but then there's always going to be very small amounts that are very hard to capture, and you need much better technology, and that better technology is much more costly. So if we want to reduce a lot of pollution, at the margin it's going to be very costly. Now, in terms of the marginal benefit of reducing pollution, if we do no pollution reduction, then the marginal benefit of reducing a little bit is high. But then as we reduce more and more and more and more, the marginal benefit declines. If you've reduced 99% of the pollution that's out there, then the marginal benefit of reducing that last 1% is very low. So just like any demand curve or marginal benefit curve, it's downward sloping. So let's call this marginal benefit. This is downward sloping for the exact same reason that any demand curve is downward sloping. When you don't have very much of something, you value an additional unit highly. But the more of something you have, the less you're willing to give up to get another unit at the margin. This is why the first bite at the buffet is always the best bite, right? But then as you continue to eat, each consecutive bite gives you less and less benefit. And by the time you're full, one more bite's not doing you much good at all. Now, what we've seen in this class is that we get the right outcome when marginal benefit and marginal cost are equal. A decision maker takes an action as long as the marginal benefit is higher than the marginal cost, never when the marginal cost is higher than the marginal benefit. So the right amount of pollution reduction is right here. Let's call it Q star. Don't confuse this with production of some good. We're talking about how much pollution should we reduce. The conclusion that we get here is that we should not reduce all pollution. We need to reduce pollution until the marginal benefit of reducing pollution is equal to the marginal cost of reducing pollution. Okay? Let's think about, in terms of some private solutions to externalities, let's talk about something that we call the Coase Theorem. Coase Theorem states, created or first written about by an economist named Ronald Coase. And what Dr. Coase said is that as long as transaction costs are low, then the firms or the parties that are involved in the negative externality are going to have an incentive to come to some agreement between themselves that will eliminate the externality. Okay, so let's just say that private bargaining, that's the key thing. Private bargaining will fix the problem. So here's the idea. Let's suppose that I own the lake, and no, let's change it. Let's suppose that there's a river. Looks like this. And let's suppose I own a resort down here. Here's a resort. And up here is a firm that generates electricity. So let's just say the electric plant. And so I own this resort. Here's the electric plant. This is a public river. And let's suppose that this plant, as part of the generation of electricity, let's suppose they take in some water, they heat it up, they use it to cool off some of their, I don't know, turbines or something. And then they emit that warm water back out into the river. Okay, so there's warm water getting emitted back into the river. Let's suppose the river flows this way, towards my resort. And let's suppose that warm water makes it uncomfortable for people at my resort to get into the water. Okay? And so that's hurting my business. So here's what the Coase Theorem says. The Coase Theorem says that I have an incentive as the resort owner to go to the electric plant and offer to pay them to reduce the amount of warm water that they emit into the river. I have an incentive because I'm losing out on some of my profits that I would make otherwise. So up to the amount of my losses, I would have an incentive to pay them to reduce the temperature. And we can show theoretically that, yeah, there is an incentive, and we can also show that the electricity plant would also have an incentive to make a deal with me as long as the transaction costs are low. The problem with this is that it doesn't apply a lot. It's nice to think that there could be some private bargaining that goes on, but a lot of times what we see out there in the real world is that the firms tend not to negotiate with the resort, and especially if there are a lot of people. Let's suppose it's not just one electricity plant. Suppose it's multiple plants. The bottom line is that the Coase Theorem is nice theoretically, but it doesn't apply very often. So let's think about some government remedies. The first one that we'll think about is a tax. If you look at this picture, if we go back and look at this picture, you should recognize this picture, or at least, let's say, this picture should remind you of something that we did earlier in the class, and that was when we were analyzing a tax. There, when we analyzed a tax, we had a curve shifted by the amount of the tax, and this picture's similar. Now, what we need to do is clear this off and draw a different picture, because in our tax picture, we actually had it shifted the different direction than this one. So let's clear this off, and then we'll draw another picture and see how a tax can be used to fix an externality. All right, let's draw a picture of what this will look like. We have a negative externality. So we don't need to worry about what the good is. Let's just suppose that production of this good creates some negative externality. Okay, so we've got demand curve that represents the benefit that consumers get from the good, and then we have our supply curve that represents the costs. But remember, we're going to have this private supply curve that represents the private costs of production for the firms, and then there's going to be this external cost. We can draw another supply curve that represents, we called it social, that represents the full costs associated with production of the good. And the vertical distance here is the amount of the external cost that's passed on. So the free market quantity we found was right here. Let's call it Q1, P1. Now, this picture should look very similar to the picture that we saw with a tax. So what we saw is that if we impose a tax, then we can illustrate that tax graphically one of two ways. Actually, there's three ways, but two of them involve shifting a curve. We could illustrate a tax by either shifting the supply curve up by the amount of the tax, or we could have shifted the demand curve down by the amount of the tax. But if we're sitting here at this point, let's call it point A. If we're sitting at point A and we wanted to get to this outcome, which we would call point B, that's the efficient outcome, then if we imposed a tax of this vertical distance on the sellers, then that would shift that supply curve up by the amount of the tax, which in this case is equal to the external cost. So the tax would be equal to the external cost, the cost that's being passed on. If we were to impose that tax, then that would result in this outcome, Q star, and this price. So you can see that if we were to impose a tax equal to the amount of the cost that's being passed on, then that would fix this problem. Let's think about the challenges with that. The first challenge, the first and most obvious challenge, is that the government would need to know how big the external cost was in order to figure out how big to make the tax. And that's challenging because the costs that get passed on oftentimes it's hard to put a number on those. Actually, if you're interested in that, I teach another class called Natural Resource Economics, Econ 4020, where we would look at how you put a dollar amount on that. We can do it. We've got some techniques that we can use to place dollar values on things that are very hard to place a dollar value on. But that's one of the challenges with this, is that the government, it's not obvious what that tax should be. And you might think, well, let's just go out and ask people. What do they think the tax or the external cost that they're bearing is going to be? Well, people have an incentive to exaggerate that. There are some reliable techniques that we can use. Let's leave it at that. Here's an interesting thing about this. What we know is that we could get that efficient outcome by taxing the producers. We could also get that efficient outcome if we tax the buyers. Politically, that seems like a much an unpopular thing to do. The general public typically doesn't understand that it doesn't matter who you place the tax on, the outcome is going to be the same. But if we're trying to create a tax that fixes a pollution problem and we tax anybody but the creators of the pollution, that's easy to criticize. Even though from an economics perspective, we know that it doesn't matter. It has the exact same outcome in the end. If we wanted to have a similar remedy for a positive externality, instead of a tax, we would need a subsidy. Because we know that with a positive externality, too little of the good is bought and sold, too little of the good is produced, so we would need a subsidy to increase production of that good. Let's talk about some market-based systems. Actually, before we talk about that, let me just add on one thing to this government remedy, and that is another thing that the government could do is what's referred to as command and control. And that simply means that the government, instead of using a tax, can just set a quantity. Instead of using a tax to try to influence the amount of the good that creates the pollution, the government could just say, you know what, here's the amount of pollution that you can create. It's referred to as command and control. The problem is that different producers have different technology, different producers create different amounts of pollution, and the government doesn't have the ability to know those quantities that are being produced of pollution by the producers. So that makes it very challenging for the government to try to somehow tell each firm how much pollution to emit. Market-based systems, one of the obvious ones is what's referred to as a tradable permit system. Tradable permit system. Essentially, the way a tradable permit system works is that the government issues some rights to pollute. And then once those rights to pollute are issued to the firms can buy and sell them from each other. And we don't have time in this class to really go into why that's a good system. And a lot of times when you first hear that, it seems weird because it seems odd to people that the government should somehow be in the business of giving people the right to pollute. Once you understand that the right amount of pollution is not zero, it starts to feel less weird to you. But if you're under the impression that the right amount of pollution is zero, then you certainly would not agree with the government allowing people or giving people permission, firms permission to pollute. What we do know, though, is that these systems are very good ways of reducing the amount of pollution to the efficient amount. As a matter of fact, if you were to go back several decades, there used to be a problem with what was referred to as acid rain. Actually, it was a very big problem. It was the problem with sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere combining with rain droplets falling back to the ground and creating all kinds of problems, health problems and problems with food production because it killed plants, and problems with buildings because that acid rain starts to wear down the outer surfaces of buildings. It created a lot of problems, and the way that problem was solved was through a tradable permit system. Sulfur acid rain is not a problem. Now, we did not reduce the amount of sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere to zero. We reduced it to the point where it's not creating a lot of problems that outweigh the costs of the good products that we get that create it as a byproduct. There are several issues with tradable permit system, and again, if you're interested in that, we have a class where we would talk extensively about the good things and the bad things having to do with the tradable permit system. But it does result, if done correctly, in the efficient amount of the good being produced. Let's talk here a little bit about 4 different categories of goods. 4 categories of goods. And we're going to think about a couple of dimensions that we're going to use in this discussion. The first is what we call rivalry. Rivalry. So rivalry is when one person's consumption reduces the amount of the good there is available for other people to consume. We would say that the good is rival. Most goods are rival. An example would be a pizza. So if we have some people in a room and we have a pizza and I consume a piece of the pizza, then that's one piece of pizza that can't be consumed by anybody else. We would say that a good like that, like a pizza, is rival. Most goods are that way, right? If I go to the store and I buy anything and I use it, I consume it, then that means that that can't be consumed by somebody else. Okay? Another dimension of a good that we're going to think about is what we call excludability. A good is excludable if anybody who doesn't pay for the good can be excluded from consuming it. So for example, you can't consume the pizza unless you pay the seller for the pizza. And I know that you might be thinking, well, I could if I steal it. We're not talking about breaking the rules. Most goods are excludable. And what that means is that you don't consume it unless you compensate the seller for it. Okay? So most goods are rival and most goods are excludable. Not all are, though. So let's now think about 4 categories of goods, and they're all going to differ in terms of whether or not they're rival and whether or not they're excludable. So the first one that we're going to think about is what we call private goods. Most goods are private goods, and that means that the good is both rival and excludable. So just about any good that you think of, especially if it's a physical good, most services as well, though. So a haircut, it's excludable and it's rival. If you consume the haircut, then that's a haircut that somebody else can't consume. The person cutting the hair can't be cutting both heads of hair at the same time. It's excludable in that you can't walk in and get a haircut without paying for it. So pizzas, haircuts, lots of goods, just about everything that you thought about would be in this category of private goods. There's also what we call public goods. Public goods, let's say these are rival and excludable. Rival and excludable. I'll just abbreviate it. Public goods are non-rival and non-excludable. Non-rival and non-excludable. So let's think about some examples. Once you hear some examples, it starts to become obvious what falls into this category. So these would be things like, let's say, public television. So public television is non-rival. In other words, I can turn my TV set on and watch public television, and that doesn't diminish the amount of public television that there is available for everybody else to watch. We could all be watching it at the same time. It's also non-excludable in the sense that it's broadcast over the airwaves. If you've got an antenna, you can pick it up for free. You don't have to pay for it. You don't have to somehow compensate the producers of public television. They will have telethons where they ask you to do it, but you can still watch it even if you don't. So public television is non-rival and non-excludable. Other examples would be things like national defense. It's non-rival. I can enjoy the benefits of having national defense, the security that we have, and that doesn't diminish your ability to enjoy it. And I get to enjoy it even if I don't contribute anything to it. I don't have to support it. It's non-excludable. I realize that taxes go to it and all of that, but it still falls into this category. Here's what we tend to see in this type of situation. With public goods, we tend to see that the free market doesn't result in the right production of it. And the main issue here is that what we see is that there's a lot of what we call free riding. So if you've ever watched public television and not sent a check in, what you were doing is free riding. You were taking advantage of the fact that you can consume it without paying. It's a very natural thing to do. And there are other situations where we tend to see that. And it's true for public radio, public television, national defense. And again, in a natural resource economics class, we would talk more about that. Let's talk about the third category. It's what we call quasi-public goods. A quasi-public good would be one that is non-rival but excludable. So this would be something like satellite radio or satellite TV. So if you don't pay for a subscription, then you can't capture the signal, but it's still non-rival because my consumption of it doesn't diminish the ability for anybody else to consume it. And then finally we have what are referred to as common resources. Common resources are rival but non-excludable. Rival but non-excludable. So these are things like the buffalo in the American West. So you couldn't exclude people from hunting the buffalo back when the U.S. was expanding westward, but they're rival because if one person captures a buffalo, kills a buffalo, then that's one that somebody else can't. We could think about flowers in a public park. That's probably flowers in a public park. And you might say, I don't see too many flowers in a public park. Well, here's why. Because they're common resources. They are rival. If I pick a flower in a public park, that means that nobody else can enjoy that flower, but it's non-excludable. We can't stop people from doing it. What we tend to see is that common resources get exploited. That's why the idea of seeing flowers in a public park might not be something that you're very familiar with, because a lot of times they get picked and you don't see them. Let's talk about demand for a public good. So let's go back to this one and think about demand for a public good. You've talked about how to figure out what the market demand curve for a private good looks like. And the market demand curve for a private good, we know, is just the horizontal summation of all of the individual demand curves. So it looks something like this. I'll draw a little picture. We've got a demand curve, another demand curve. This could be person 1, person 2. If we wanted to figure up the market demand curve, we'd pick a price, P1. We'd go over and see how much this person wants to consume. At that same price of P1, we'd see how much this person wants to consume. And that tells us that if these are the only two buyers in the market at that price of P1, the total amount is going to be this amount plus that amount. It's going to be something out here. And that's going to be a point on our market demand curve. That's how you get a market demand curve for a private good, a good that is both rival and excludable. If we want to figure out what the demand curve for a public good looks like, it's going to be different. Because it's non-rival, my consumption of the good doesn't diminish this person's ability to consume it. And so you can't just add up the quantities. It doesn't make sense. And so let's clear this off, and then we'll take a look at how we construct the demand curve for a public good. In order to think about what the market demand curve for a public good looks like, I'm going to draw a picture, and it'll be similar to the kind of horizontal summation, except now what we have to do is add vertically. So let's do this. Let's start down here at the bottom. I'm going to think about, let's say, person 1 down here. Let's put person 2 right here. And then we're going to think about the market demand curve up here. So now, keep in mind that because this good is non-rival, it doesn't make sense to think about adding up the quantities. If we think about public television as a good example, if I consume an hour of public television and you consume an hour of public television at the same time, then there's still only 1 hour of public television that's been provided. We can all consume it at exactly the same time. It's very different from a slice of pizza. If I consume a slice of pizza and you consume a slice of pizza, then 2 slices of pizza had to be created. So that's why we can't, in the case of a public good, add up the quantity. If we're talking about public television, there's only 24 hours in a day, and all of us could consume 24 hours a day of public television, and still they only need to supply 24 hours a day. So instead what we do is we add up how much we value it. So if you value a unit of it at a certain amount, and I value a unit, that same unit, at a certain amount, we can certainly add up the value to get the total value that you and I place on the good. So let's think about a quantity. And let's go up to this demand curve to see what this consumer is willing to pay for that particular quantity of the good. Here would be consumer 1's willingness to pay. We'll call it willingness to pay 1. And then if we think about at that quantity what this consumer is willing to pay. This consumer is willing to pay this amount. Let's call it willingness to pay 2. So if this consumer is willing to pay that amount and this consumer is willing to pay that amount, then the total willingness to pay for this quantity would be this distance plus that distance. It would be somewhere up here. So this would be willingness to pay 1 plus willingness to pay 2. That would be total willingness to pay. And the market demand curve, we would just add up the willingness to pay at each quantity. It's a vertical summation. So if we're thinking about the optimal amount of a public good to provide, then what we would be doing is thinking about a market picture. So if we were to think about this as being public television, then there's some supply curve, there's this market demand curve that we've gotten through this vertical summation. Here's the market demand curve, the market supply curve, and the optimal quantity, of course, would be that quantity right there, where that demand curve is the vertical summation of the individual demand curves. The question, of course, is would the free market provide that quantity of a public good? And the answer is no, it won't. If we leave it up to the free market, because the good is non-excludable, you don't have to actually pay that amount to consume that quantity. You can be a free rider. So what we tend to see is that people's contribution to it in practice is actually much lower than their full amount that they value it, which means that the demand curve, the actual demand curve that would come from people actually contributing amounts of money to public television is much lower, and so we end up with a much smaller quantity than the efficient quantity. That's why it's provided typically through government grants, because the free market would result in too little of the good. So again, too little of the good with a free market, and the reason is because of the free rider problem. Let's think about common resources, that last type of good that we thought about, or common goods. If we're thinking about a common property good or a common resource, and the example that we talked about was flowers in a public park. The problem with that type of good is that let's go with the hunting example. If we think about buffalo, and this would be true of any resource, extraction of any resource, whether it's a buffalo or whether it's timber in a forest, or whether or not it's fish in a pond or flowers in a park, it doesn't matter. But if we're thinking about buffalo as an example, if a hunter takes a buffalo, then they incur the costs, but not all of the costs. And what's going on there is that if somebody harvests a buffalo, then it becomes much harder for other people. Let's say not much. It becomes harder for other people to harvest from that resource. So that cost is being passed on to somebody else. The hunter would capture all of the benefits, but able to pass on some of the costs. And what we see is that in that case, buffalo were overhunted. They were overharvested. The free market results in us abusing the resource, not because anybody's necessarily doing anything wrong, but because the property rights associated with a common pool resource like buffalo or flowers in a park allow people to pass on a cost to other people, and it just results in a misuse of the resource. If you'd like to read more about that, there's the concept here is known as the tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons. It is why common property resources or common property is a very, very bad way to establish property rights. If you're interested in the tragedy of the commons, there's a paper that's called A Tale of Two Fisheries. Actually, it's an article, Tale of Two Fisheries. It was published in the New York Times years ago. It is a very, very good explanation for why the tragedy of the commons happens. They write it in terms of, I think the article is written about different types of fishing, but mainly they focus on lobster fishing. And it's not written for an academic audience. It was written for the popular press, and it's a very interesting article. I would highly encourage you to read that if you're interested in how we can fix the tragedy of the commons. It's a problem, but it's also a problem that has some solutions, and there are actually some interesting solutions. So hopefully that gives you an idea of some of the issues that we think about when we're talking about the right amount of pollution. Externalities, positive and negative. It's an issue that we need to think about. There are lots of externalities out there, and it's an example of when the free market doesn't work as good as we would hope, but there are some solutions that we can use to get to an efficient outcome. So I'll see you in a future video.